I walk my dogs every morning. And I promise you this, if every time that alarm went off, if every time when my feet hit the ground, I gave myself the choice, do I want to do this? I'm not going to be walking very often, right? Because it's just, again, asking ourselves that every time, whatever feeling I'm having at that time is usually going to direct what I decide to do.
Welcome to Gap to Gig, the show for dads navigating the in-between season when work, identity, and priorities start asking different questions. Here we talk about what that season looks like and how to move through it with intention. I'm your host, Michael Jacobs, and our guest today is Dr. Matt Campbell, a clinical psychologist with more than 20 years of experience helping people navigate stress, burnout, and behavior change. He's the creator of the Primal Five Framework, which focuses on 5 foundational areas that quietly shape how we show up every day: sleep, sunlight, movement, connection, and what we consume. His work centers on a simple but powerful idea. Most people are not broken, they're depleted. And for dads trying to build meaningful work while staying present at home, I think that idea hits really close to home. Matt, welcome to Gap to Gig. I'm really happy you're here today. Thanks for
Right.
joining me.
Thanks for having me. Look forward to it.
My pleasure. Me too. So I want to start with this idea that most people aren't broken, but rather depleted.
Right.
And when a dad says, like, I just can't find balance right now, what do you hear that he might not be saying out loud?
Well, I think at the most basic level, my concern is he taking care of the basics? Is he taking care of the things that we're made for? I think a lot of times these are things in our busy lives. We prioritize family and trying to be there for them. But I think often we we look at these basics as negotiable when they're not.
Can you give me an example of what one of these basics would be?
I think for most of us, the most common basic would be our sleep. I think
Mm.
so often sleep is something we'll catch up on, or sleep is almost a convenience. Sometimes people talk about it almost as something that's a rite of passage, that how little sleep we got. It can almost seem like it's merit that we hardly slept last night, or we were so busy doing things. So I think sleep is probably the one I hear most frequently.
Sure, that makes sense. I know you talk a lot about like things being a capacity problem, not a time problem. And I imagine sleep would be part of that capacity issue of making sure you have the capacity to sleep or the time to sleep.
Right.
Can you, for a dad that's tired, can you unpack like at the end of the long day,
Right.
what would, what should we recognize in terms of the capacity issues that we're challenged with, where we kind of just say, "Oh, I just don't have time for that." Like, I don't have time for sleep. What is really what should I be unpacking here?
Well, I think it's about trying to figure out what the priorities are. I think that oftentimes, I don't have time for it. I think that it's the most basic of needs that we have. I think that, and I know I can speak for myself, raising 4 boys. I know that oftentimes the very way that you want to be with them is really dependent on how well we attend to these things. And just to kind of take a step back, I often find that if I understand the concept or the idea, then it can help me and maybe others as well. But the
Sure.
idea, the reason for calling it our primal five is we live in a time that just doesn't match our biology. We live in a time, we think about our ancestors when our bodies came to be what they are. These are things that were required. These are things the body was made to do for survival and such. We now live at a time with technology, with everything that's available to us, where these things have to be intentional choices that we make. We have to prioritize these things, but our bodies remain the same. So we have the same mechanics, and it's whether we're going to take care of those things or not. And if we don't, logically, we're going to be worse for it. And so a lot of times when I think about, how do I do this? How do I do that? These are things that really need to be a priority for us to be able to function at the best level that we can. And so, to the tired dad, I think a lot of times, A lot of times we say we don't have time, but we're really not doing things that entire time. Maybe it is that extra time on a phone. And I know I have made the statement of, well, it's my only downtime of the day. It's the only time I can do these things. I get it. I've been there many times, but I think that recognizing how much better I'm going to be if I can consistently prioritize, we're talking about sleep right now, and that's an enormous one. But if I can prioritize that, I'm going to be better for the rest of things.
Right. Absolutely. And I think there's ways to recapture, per se, your time, right? Like, yes, I think we all need downtime, right? But like you said, like we might catch ourselves scrolling on our phones for too long. But even in a typical day, if you were to take inventory of how you spend your time,
Right.
I think you would find for most people or most dads that there are distractions. There are things that pull you away from what your intention was to do, and then depletes your capacity because now you've spent energy on things that aren't bringing you energy or getting you to the point where you can rest and restore and do the things that you need to do for yourself. Get sunlight, like is one of your primal five. And I think like I love this idea of harkening back to where our ancestors came in terms of what is important to ourselves, because in this day and age with things being online and we're constantly looking at our devices on social media, we're
Right.
constantly sharing things, and it seems like we're always in communication, always doing something. Everything is more sped up today than it was even 20 years ago, I think. And to figure out a way to slow ourselves down a little bit to make sure we take care of ourselves. Because I think if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, we have to take care of ourselves in order to do the other things that we want to take care of, including taking care of our family, including doing work that means something to us, doing the things we want to do day to day. You can spend all your energy doing one of those things, but if you don't take care of yourself, you're only going to have so much energy to expend, right? And if
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that you could go really far with what you have just described. I think that there is in the day to day, taking care of ourselves in these ways and prioritizing it. I think that you can look at our longevity and our health. I think being a psychologist, one of the things that I look at a great deal is how it affects our emotional functioning. And this really came about through clinical work and seeing so frequently how deficient these are. And so they're so simple in a sense. They're simple in idea. In application, the numbers tell us it's quite different. And so I think that, the effects are just incredible when you look at the research and you look at what it not only what it does to us, but I think so often what we're accustomed to. I think that's a lot of times what makes these things difficult. We know them, but we're also so used to being sleep deprived.
yeah,
We're so used to, maybe grogginess and just using caffeine and things like that to supplement us. I think we're so accustomed to bad food,
yeah,
so much that it's our normal, and we're the only thing we can compare our experience to is what we've experienced previously. And so I think it's normal. And we don't even realize the depletion.
right. Are we taking shortcuts? Is that what we're doing here? Like when we do drink an extra cup of coffee, or we, you know, drink something with more caffeine in it, or take a supplement, like, is that just a temporary shortcut? Or should we be looking at this not just day to day, but like the longer term compounding effects of what we're doing? Like, is caffeine great for us in the long run? Or do we need more sunlight every day? Does that help us become better people?
Well, I think that I hesitate sometimes because I think it can so easily come off as kind of judgy and critical. And I think that realistically, looking at us as humans, we're wired for the short term, maximize pleasure, minimize pain. And we live in a world where there are so many short term options. So, again, hearkening back to our ancestors, they did not need to make so many choices that we have to make. We have to be so much more intentional about these things because there's always something that can give us a crutch, can get us by in the moment. We can recognize that something's important, but it's tough to apply it because we're getting distracted. We're getting focused on this thing this day. And so I think that one of the things that's so important is the recognition that this isn't laziness. It is challenging to do these things. We have to be, really focused on them. And I think the other thing is we have to stack these things because when we start stacking them, when we create a habit, that's when we realize what we were missing before. That's when we
Sure.
realize how much different things can be by taking care of these.
And I think you're kind of already alluding to this, but I'm curious. Many dads that I talk to, not everybody, but they feel like they're always falling short, whether it's at home or at work, typically at home. But on the outside, they seem high functioning. They seem responsible, right? I see them at the events for their kids, or they tell me about what they've been up to, and it seems like they're doing a lot, but they still feel like they're falling short. Is that Why do you think that is? Is that just because of some of these short term, so many different decisions we have to make every day that we just kind of go making these short term decisions, or is there something else to it?
I think there's a lot to that. I think there's a lot to that. I do think that we're more likely to have negative emotions, and I mean, I know that from what we know from the research, but we're certainly more likely to have more negative and painful emotions and have a harder time regulating those emotions when we're depleted, when we're not taking care of these things. But I also think that just from the human perspective, we value this role as a father so much. We
Yeah.
want so much to do it as well as is possible. And then I think there's that comparison effect. I think that we see what we're hearing from others or what we're seeing that, others' kids have opportunities for these different things. And, it's just like most things when we're around other people, we tend to believe what people present. You know, we all are trying to put forth our best. And I think we tend to believe others and then we're gonna feel, deficient, inadequate, and what have you.
Right. Right. I'm curious, what does depletion actually look like in real life? Not necessarily the clinical
Right.
definition of it, but like, how does it show up in day to day moments?
I think it can show up really in any variety. And maybe this is a bias because it's something I've noticed within myself. I've noticed irritability more. I've noticed that when my body is not where it needs to be, that minor inconveniences are more irritating. And, that's that negative feedback loop because we're irritable. We don't want to be irritable with our families or friends. We don't want to be irritable. And then that makes us feel worse about it. And, then we're trying to make up for it or we're, just being self-critical and things like that. So, I think that that irritability, handling the feelings that we're having, those times where we look back at it and we feel bad because we overreacted to something and we realize that
Right.
really wasn't that big of a deal, that my son or my daughter did. I think that is certainly one of the signs of depletion.
Interesting. I'm kind of processing what you're saying in real time, and I'm wondering, could anxiety also be a way that depletion shows up,
Oh,
or is that something totally
no,
separate?
undoubtedly. Anxiety, for example, exercise, movement, an amazing anxiety management technique, such a release of energy. It's incredibly helpful in that regard.
Sure.
When we're talking about the depletion, we talk about consumption and our fuel sources. I think that when we're taking in, like, one of the things in consumption as I'm putting it forward and or trying to encourage on is the news. Well, if I get
Yep.
caught up in that, again, it's something humans are not made for, to have all of this information. Well, that's gonna raise my anxiety. That's going to affect it a great deal. So all of these things certainly can have a pretty profound impact on anxiety.
Absolutely. And do you think that it kind of snowballs a bit where the more you get depleted, the more you for you it becomes irritability, for somebody else it might be anxiety, maybe for somebody else it's lethargy. It could be a lot, many different things, if I'm understanding correctly. Does that kind of then you start to get into this tailspin of like, okay, now I'm more irritable, so I react differently, and that just makes it worse, which then depletes me more, which then causes my irritability to go even higher. And is that just sort of like a cycle it's difficult to break, or is it just it happens and you move on kind of
I
situation?
definitely think it's a cycle. I definitely think that we try to make up for it in the moment. You mentioned the caffeine, right? Of course, all of us are gonna have some caffeine, or most all of us are gonna have some caffeine.
Sure.
But when we're really using that, I mean, just think about that as an example. I'm using caffeine to try to stay alert. I'm using it throughout the day. Well, what is that caffeine going to do when I'm using it throughout the day? Yeah, it's going to give me that 30 minute, I'm sorry, boost, and then it's going to fade. But then I'm drinking caffeine into the afternoon. Now, what am I putting in jeopardy? Falling asleep that night. And so I'm going to be more fatigued the next day again because of this. And so it feeds itself. Absolutely. And of course, I think the response to that would be, well, then what do I do in that, for that day? Am I just supposed to be tired the whole day? And some of that's a yes. I also think it's really about what we know about caffeine. The general rule is cut it off at noon,
Yep.
to help ourselves with that sleep that night.
Right. It's so interesting. So you've mentioned that patience and presence are like biological states before their mindsets. It's really interesting to me that that can be, and it's starting to make sense to me now. Like, I mean, you told me this before, but now I'm trying to like, with what you're telling me now, it's like, oh, it's now maybe it makes a little bit of sense. What does that really mean though in practice?
Well, I think that we're gonna have more patience the more grounded we are in what we're doing. We're gonna be able to have so much more perspective on things. We're very likely gonna be living in a way that kind of fits more with what we think is right and healthy and a clear, the clearer the conscience, the more perspective that we can have. It
Right.
doesn't become so clouded. And so when we can take care of these things and when we're feeling healthy, feeling healthy has a profound impact on being present, on being available when we're not worrying about some deficiency or some difficulty that we're experiencing in this regard. It's much easier to be present for others.
Right. Right. And so this idea of like to get to the point where we can be present and we do have patience, like there is it is a biological state to some degree or a chemical state to some degree. It's not just like, okay, today I'm going to be more patient, right? Like there is things that, and I suppose that's what the Primal Five is about boosting up those different elements to allow yourself to be more present, to allow yourself to be more patient by taking care of the things that would normally drain you and prevent you from being present, being active.
And I
Is
don't
that a
even
fair
think that,
assumption?
yeah, I don't even think it has to be as intentional. I think it's a byproduct. And so I don't even think it's something where we have to say, well, I'm going to be more patient today.
Right.
I think a lot of times we just have the resources available to do just that. I think in some ways, it just becomes more of a natural thing rather than having to tell ourselves to do that. And
Right.
I think it just comes easier to us. It comes easier to handle something that may otherwise be anxiety provoking. I think that all of the sudden we're again kind of grounded. We have more of our facilities to take care of things rather than we're playing from behind all the time, because that's really what depletion is we're playing from behind. We're trying to catch up. And that's when we're going to use those short-term techniques is when we're just trying to play catch up.
Right. No, it makes sense. So I want to walk through your Primal Five framework because we've kind of danced around it a little bit, or at least on the surface of it. I want to dig a little bit deeper because it's so interesting to me. And I think that even if, you kind of mentioned this earlier, of like, we just focus on one thing, right? Like just as a starting point to start to prevent some of this depletion or to replenish our batteries, I think it's really interesting to look at what these five things are. Cause I know personally, like I'll admit, I don't think about all these every day. I probably could use a lot more sunlight, right? I spend way too much time in front of my computer at my desk,
Right.
right? And so, but before we get to sunlight, let's start with sleep.
Yeah.
What is a realistic shift that a dad who's really busy right now can make that actually would move the needle here?
I think that one of the shifts, I think we know a lot of them. I think that we know that, having a consistent bedtime, having a consistent routine for 30 minutes or an hour before bed is important. We mentioned the caffeine consumption earlier, limiting
Sure.
these kind of things, limiting screens before bed, these kind of things. One of the things that I think is lesser appreciated, but often very, very important, has to do with waking time. I think oftentimes if we can get consistency there, it starts setting us up because sleep is all about conditioning. It's all about loading into the circadian rhythm. And so that's why the falling asleep part is, trying to find that time is that it's just our body. It just adapts. It becomes conditioned that this is bedtime. I had a friend one time, or an old friend of mine, we would be sitting there hanging out. It would be a bunch of couples hanging out and things like that. When the clock hit 11, it didn't matter what we were doing. He was asleep. He had a routine, maybe too
Yeah.
much of a routine, really. But his circadian rhythm was locked in. And of course, we're not going to get that way. That's pretty rare. But that's the
Right.
idea. And wake time is just, it's the same thing as the time we go to bed.
I love that how we talk about sleep. It seems like the conversation is always around going to sleep.
Right.
We never think about when is the right time to wake up and what are like the healthy habits around waking up. And I imagine it's different for each person, but finding what the right wake up time is for you, it's part of that element of consistency that you need for healthy sleep, right? Of
Right.
getting the right amount of sleep. Yeah, if you go to bed on time, that helps. You also have to wake up on time. And if you know, whether you wake up too early or too late, like as you said, it can mess with your circadian rhythms or what have you. So it's really interesting that you've kind of just flipped the lens for me of I always think about like what time should I be going to sleep? Really, I'd also be thinking about what time do I get up and
Well,
how do I do that
right.
consistently?
Because oftentimes when we're working on sleep, one of the things that we're trying to do is to address the compensatory techniques. So that's things like sleeping in, you know, really late, caffeine, naps during the day, things like that. Those are things that kind of make bad sleep at night better in the short term. Now our bodies still need what they need, but we can make it
Right.
through the day better. But we're basically kicking the can down the road is that's going to need to be addressed at some point. And
Yeah.
right to what we're talking about, wake time, having a consistent wake time is important. I think though, this also reminds me of something that I think can be a roadblock for people is the idea that perfection is needed. It's not. It's not needed. I think it keeps people away from working at these things. We're looking for improvement. We are looking
Yeah.
for improvement. That is the goal. Perfection's not even possible. So why make it something that we think on is that we're just trying to improve it. It doesn't need to be that at 6:30 every morning, every day of the week that I'm up, but we're just trying to trend more into something that kind of fits with what our bodies are made for.
Right. That makes sense. So let's move on to sunlight because, like I said, that's one that when I was first setting up on Primal Five, I'm like, yeah, I don't think about this one nearly enough, or really at all, to be honest. Like I enjoy getting outside sometimes, but many times I'm just like, yeah, it's I've got something to do here. It's inside. I'll do it. And especially between depending on where you live, your days might be
Mhm.
shorter
Yeah.
some time of the year and gonna be longer other times of the year. And we're getting to the point where when most people listen to this episode, it's going to be the longest days of the year
Mhm.
where they are if they're in the US. And so why does it why does sunlight really matter more than people think? And whether the day is long or the day is short, how can we, especially as dads, fit that into our typical day?
Well, absolutely. Sunlight is huge for mood. It's a mood enhancer. It really helps us. Again, if you think our ancestors didn't have climate controlled environments, they were outside
Right.
all the time. And so, obviously our bodies are going to be made for that. And it's funny you mentioned that as far as it's not something that we think all the time. When I was going, through these things and I was doing some research and looking at what was out there, I was even surprised, even though I preach it all the time, basically, when I was looking at just how much of a mood enhancer getting outside is. You asked about, for a dad, what would be a good thing to start with? It's pretty straightforward. Get outside in the morning. When you're having your cup of coffee, when you're, reading whatever you're going to look at maybe in the morning to get going, do it on the porch. Do it just outside to get it because morning sunlight is the ideal. 15, 30 minutes morning sunlight is gold. It's not only gold because it's kind of setting us up, it's that mood enhancement earlier, but it's actually a sleep management technique. Getting back to the circadian rhythm is it's locking in that at that time it's daytime. And
Yeah.
so that getting it in the morning really helps our body to kind of get locked in on these things when all we have is artificial light. It's not telling our body this. And so it's also helpful for that. And it's just as simple as, again, doing whatever we're going to do anyway in the morning, but just doing it outside, sitting on a porch, on a patio, whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that the idea of just working it into your existing routine, right? Because I think, at least for me, I will overthink it like, okay, I need to get outside more. So now I got to build in time to do that. And what am I going to do at that time? And how am I going to do this? Like, I could just, whatever I'm already doing,
Hmm.
just shift it out, weather permitting, shift it outside,
Right.
right? And get some of that sunlight exposure. And even that, I think ideally for a lot of dads, it's doing it with the kids, doing it with the family,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Whatever whatever time you're going to spend with them, can we do that outside? And we
Yeah.
could all get a little bit of sunlight, right? It doesn't
Abs-
have to be a solo adventure every time we want to go outside. And probably a lot of dads are already doing that, right? They're playing with their kids in the yard, or they're taking them to the park, or they're just doing things outside. They're going for walks, whatever it may be. Um,
And I think that also speaks to something else that I think is important and provides maybe a little bit of context for we don't have to spend all day focused on these things. Like, for example, you mentioned spending time with the kids, going out and doing these things. Absolutely. But we can stack these things as well. I remember one person I worked with and what they did was, they were struggling in these areas. So it was someone who'd played tennis when they were a kid. And so they went out and they there's a, group of guys that would play tennis, a time or two a week. Well, now they're outside, they're moving their bodies and they're having connection, they're interacting with other people. So we're knocking several things out. Every morning I go take my dogs for a walk. So I'm moving, I'm outside. So we can stack things and that makes them, a good bit easier to do.
yeah, I love that idea of you can get your sunlight and you can get your movement, right? Which is kind of the next one I want to move on to. And also connection. Like sometimes it's good. especially for busy parents, like it's hard to get some of that social connection sometimes. And,
Sure.
there are different ways to do that. And one of those ways could be joining if you're interested in sports, joining a local, rec team for softball outside, or, you know, playing, you know, going to the pickleball courts and playing pickleball with your friends, or doing something so you get some of that social connection, also getting some exercise or some movement in, and also doing that outdoors. So you're getting some of that sunlight that we tend to neglect
Yeah.
or don't think about as much.
And I also think that one of the things I'm kind of on the twilight, part of my parenting, meaning my oldest is 21, my youngest is 14, and I have a 17 and a 20-year-old in between. And so, I'm kind of at that stage where, they're either on their own doing college, or, my intelligence level has gone way down, because they're teenagers now and things like that. But one of the things that, especially thinking back through it, I did this it's something I wish I did more of, was letting my kids see me do some of the sports. I remember how much my kids loved it coming out when I was playing church league basketball, and I
Yeah,
think that it's a great thing to model, to give the example of that activity, competitiveness, things like that. I think that's great for them. I think it sets a great example. I think it also can help them create more of a lifelong love themselves of these things. And so I think it's great for them, even if we, feel like, well, it's me playing basketball or going, golf or whatever. Well, have them come with you, you know?
yep,
Know a lot of guys
absolutely.
fishing and, and hunting and different things. And it's just become a great bonding thing. Everybody benefits.
100%. I couldn't agree with you more. I was just doing that recently with my kids, of like, we went and played pickleball outside. And it's just
Yeah,
like, all
yeah.
right, let's go do this. Right. And it was a little bit of time outdoors, some fresh air, some movement, hanging out, having some laughs. Right. So there's some connection there too. It was just like, but you don't have to force it either. Right. Like, you don't have to be like, okay, from 7 to 8 every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we're doing this outside. Right. It can be a little bit less formal than that.
It can be spontaneous. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Right.
It's awesome when it can involve them. I don't think it has to. I
Yeah.
think it's good for them to see that we do different things, and that we have, that we're humans. That, we do things with friends and all of this. I think that kind of balance, I think that sometimes that's the best thing that we can do, is not have all the focus be on them. I think it it,
Right.
it helps them have a more realistic view of the world.
Right, and gives them an opportunity to explore
Yeah.
at their own
Yeah,
pace,
yeah, yeah.
right, as opposed to, like, what we want them to do.
Right.
So, we've talked about movement and connection, but I'm curious, what does enough movement actually look like?
We really would love 30 minutes. We'd love 30 minutes overall of movement. That's what we're looking for. And I use the term movement. I actually had a friend who is in exercise physiology, and she was looking at the workbook for me. And one of her things that or one of the suggestions that she provided for me was, why don't you move from exercise to movement? Because that's kind of what our field has done. Because I think sometimes exercise, people can, all sorts of different reactions to the idea of exercise. And that's not even really what we're going for. Just move your body. It tells your body things are okay. It's helping again with that releasing energy. So many helpful things for us physically and emotionally that occur. And also, I like movement because I think sometimes when people hear exercise, they think either what they used to do, like, you know, the amount of weight they could lift or how far they could run or what sport, and things like that. And that can feel daunting. I think it also sometimes people think of that in terms of some extreme workout regimen, one of these gyms. And I think that stuff's cool. I think it's great. If that's somebody's thing, right on. But that's not that's not the requirement.
Yeah. No, it makes total sense. I love the idea of movement. Like, I despise running. I think running is, like, I just don't like anything about running.
Right.
Nothing about it. It just it pains me emotionally, physically, whatever. Like it's just not my thing. But what I have discovered in recent years is walking,
Yeah.
right? And like not walking, not necessarily casually walking, not speed walking like in the Olympics kind of thing, but somewhere in between, right? Of getting breaking a sweat, walking long enough at a decent enough speed, right? And that is like for me, it gets me outside most of the year. You know, when the weather doesn't permit, I have to use a treadmill or something, but I prefer to do it outside. So I'm getting a little bit of sunlight, hopefully, and breaking stuff, but it also clears my mind,
Right.
right? And I always, yes, physically, my legs will get tired as I approach typically the 1 hour mark.
Oh, wow, an hour.
But
That's good.
yeah, but I leave or I finish that walk feeling more energized. I have more energy after the walk than I do before the walk. That movement for me is a replenishment, right? But it's walking. I'm not doing anything crazy. I'm not going to run a marathon. That's like my worst nightmare. I wouldn't run a 5K. I couldn't, oh, that just like gives me the shivers. Running is
Yeah,
not in my vocabulary. I don't like it. I've done it. I don't like it. Right.
yeah.
But I have discovered a different form of movement. And for me, that's walking. And for somebody else, it could be all kinds of things, right? It doesn't even have to be what we would generally consider exercise. It could be gardening or something where you're up and moving and moving from place to place or lifting things and moving whatever it might be. I mean, there's a million ways I
Right.
suppose you could do movement.
Are, and, I think of, you know, again, I don't mean to beat this into the ground, but again, think about our ancestors, they were not running marathons. They were not
Right.
lifting exceptionally large amounts of weight on, these metal objects and things like that. It's moving, it's doing the functional things that are involved in daily life. And that's what we're
Yep.
going for. It is funny though, your feelings about running. I remember watching a comedian and he said, I will start running the next time that I see someone jogging with a really big smile on their face. So that clicked with
That's
me. But I actually have seen some things that walking is every bit, if not better, than jogging. I think that there are a lot of benefits. There's benefits to sprinting and such and these things. But I think walking is really an underrated physical activity.
yep. Yeah, I'm certainly preaching the walking movement, but it might not be for everybody. I understand that, right? Just like running's not for me, and it might be for somebody else.
Sure.
But there's all to say. It's just there's options, right? We
Yeah.
just have to take the initiative to start moving,
Right.
which sometimes is easier said than done.
And it also can be incorporated in the day, right? It doesn't have to be a
Mhm.
dedicated 30 minutes. It
Right.
could be, I'm taking opportunities within my day.
Yep.
I think that most of the physiology folks would say it's great for those of us who have office jobs that we're sitting in these comfortable chairs all day long just to get up and take 5 minutes of opportunity to move around and do something. Obviously
Yep.
most all of us have heard the idea of take the stairs, when, between that and
Right.
the elevator. So there are these opportunities where we can do it throughout our day and it doesn't need to be this thing where we have to set aside, 30 minutes to an hour to do it. Sometimes it's just finding the opportunities within our day.
Right. And that's like going back to when we say we don't have enough time in the day.
Right.
That is a way to find time, right? Find
Abs-
a small pocket here, a small pocket there. You might be in between calls. You might have, 5 minutes before you're waiting for somebody to respond to your email. Like that's maybe the time to get up and move around, right?
Right.
Go up and down the stairs or go outside for a minute or two or a couple minutes and just start stacking those 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there.
Right.
And you don't need a half an hour after work to figure out when am I going to exercise. It's like, okay, you've got it spread out throughout the day when time allows for it. And what might not be the exact same time every day. That's okay. Right. But it's just that you're starting to incorporate movement into those openings that you have. And then you don't have to worry about that, finding that extra 30 minutes later.
Absolutely. Yeah, I like the way you said that. It really is something of just taking our opportunities when we can do it.
Yeah.
And, I think that again, just recognizing that's what we're made for. We're
Yeah.
made for this. And so we exercise is for our emotional, for our physical health. And even though we all love to have the six pack and the great physique, that's not really what we're going for here. That's not success, so to speak. Success is that we're taking care of ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to talk about connection. We've touched on it a bit already
Yeah.
because for me, I'm an introvert, right? So I get some of my energy comes from getting some time for myself, right? And typically the more social the setting is, the more energy it requires from me. What kind of connection actually restores energy for most people versus just taking more of it?
What this connection is referring to, it is not quantity. It's not the number of people. It's, as a fellow introvert, it really is not about having a large network at all. And in fact, there's nothing wrong with having a large network, but if we have that as our focus, we may be losing the essential part of connection, which is something with another person where the relationship is the end, right? The relationship is the reason. That person is the reason. It's not how beneficial this is to me. This isn't, it's not a means to an end. It is the end. And so, that's the idea of this is that there's a shared caring that we have or concern for one another, someone who actually will listen to what we're talking about and vice versa, because it really starts with what we can control. And so, and what we can, give and then receive from others. But yeah, it's a connection of, I have my people, I have my tribe in this world. The whole basis of it is we have a tribe, we take care of one another. And
Right.
so, and we're tribal animals. And so it's
Yeah.
trying to tap into that.
I'm wondering, again, I'm kind of processing this in real time of like, does that sort of tribal connection, I imagine, brings a feeling of security,
Oh,
um, right? Which then I imagine kind of helps replenish yourself as opposed to deplete. Cause like, you have this kind of fallback thing of like, I know there's some people that care about
right.
what I'm doing, what I'm going through. And just like I'm going to care for them, it's nice to know I have this sort of thing to fall back, these people to fall back on. Is that a
100%. Absolutely. We're not alone. And really, the thing is, there's actually a white paper on the loneliness epidemic. This is a real problem. When I was going through, and looking at some AI, for some information and such, and I was kind of going through this and having the AI, whatever platform it was, look at it. One of the things that was interesting to me is that they said, well, what's unique about what you're doing is this social connection focus, which is kind of amazing to me because it is so fundamental to us as humans that we have our people, that we're connected. We want it to be healthy, right? We're not just going for the easy fix on what's the easiest way to be around people. People can be in a room and feel alone. It's about
yeah,
a meaningful, connected relationship. And like you said, I have my people, I have my people and that does create safety and contentment.
yeah, makes sense. All right. So the last one I feel like is the biggest one. I'm not sure, like, just because it covers so much, and that's consumption, right?
Yeah.
Of the primal five. It normally we consider consumption things would be like food and calories and things, but also like media and social media, television, whatever it may be. I mean, consumption can be all sorts of things. How should we as dads think about what we're consuming, what we're letting into our systems?
Absolutely. I actually agree with everything you said about it. It is a large category, but it's also equally large in an impact. It is our fuel. What we put in our bodies is our fuel. And
Yeah,
so, it's garbage in, garbage out.
right.
That's what we take. And in fact, that is what, it's in one way we can look at it is that we're trying to reduce garbage, right? And so we have, we think about garbage food. Well, there's all sorts of different garbage with consumption, that we
Right.
have to be really cautious, that we have to be careful. We're not going to be perfect. Again, let's get that down. We're going to have fast food or we're going to grab something quick, and things like that. That's going to happen. Just accept it. I mean, really, part of any change is accepting that we're going to mess up. If mess up
Yeah.
means you failed, you're never changing anything. Just
Right.
recognize that slip ups are part of the process. But again, it's something where we understand with food. Our food, it's tough. It's tough because the processed food that's available to us taps in to that biology that sugar was less available to our ancestors. So there's a high reward basis for consuming it. It gives us that short burst of energy and things. And so the processed food, nearly all of them are going to have processed sugar in them. It gives us that short term boost. It's very reinforcing in that way. Terrible for us, but very
Yeah.
reinforcing, right? So we have these things, obviously there's substances and there's, watching out for alcohol consumption and such. We know that there's making sure that we're hydrated, that we're getting a good bit of water in. But as you said,
Right.
there's also the mental consumption and just, you know, put the shoe on the other foot. Think about it. How would you feel if your kid was watching some extreme news service all the time? Would you think that that was good for them? Would you think that whatever scrolling that can happen on social media, would you encourage that in them? You know, and another one is obviously they're the most popular websites on the internet, which are pornography sites. And just thinking, we recognize that these are bad for us, even if we don't necessarily think of them that way. We know that we
Right.
need to have moderation and limits on these things. But absolutely, we're talking about news. What is news going to hit on? Outrage, fear, because that hits the primal. We're going to pay attention to threat. We're going to pay attention to things that outrage us. And so consumption is a large category. It's our fuel and it's incredibly important.
I imagine, like, particularly with news in today's day and age, there is so much going on and a lot of negativity potentially out there. A lot of different things going on that we don't necessarily aren't necessarily feeding our souls per se, right?
Right.
And but we can't bury our heads in the sand either and not recognize like what's going on and learn about like what's going on in the world and knowing, you know, the bad things that are happening, but figuring out ways to do that in moderation or do it in a way that is not so depleting, right? Of like, okay, I know I need to, I want to stay current of what's going on in the world. And I'm not going to agree with everything that's happening in the news,
Sure.
right? But I still need to take it. Like you said, like we're not going to be perfect when it comes to our food consumption. We're not going to be perfect when it comes to our news consumption. We don't control
Mhm.
what happens in the news.
Sure.
So we're going to consume some of that. And I think it's, for me at least, like it's okay to know what's going on, but we can't just go down that rabbit hole of all the news is negative. I'm just going to focus on all that. Like I have to consume other things to keep me in check, I guess, right? Of like, there needs to be things that I find fascinating, interesting, that aren't so negative, right? Things that are going to challenge me mentally to think outside the box, help me think more creatively so that I'm not just consuming negative news all the time. Because if I just turn on, the news 24/7, I can sure fill up my news consumption,
Oh
right?
yeah.
But it's not, I don't think it's going to be very healthy for me to do that, right? I have to find other outlets for consumption. For me, I think it's like it's reading books, it's reading blog articles about things that are interesting to me that maybe aren't current events, right? Maybe it's about technology, or maybe it's about art, or maybe it's about music, whatever it might be. Of just like you kind of have to have a more, like your food consumption, you have to have a more diverse set of inputs, right? Like you're not going to eat just sugars all day, right? You're going to have fruit, you're going to have you should have some vegetables, you're going to have your fibers, your breads, whatever it might be, right?
Mhm.
My teachers are going to be like, "Why didn't you ever pay attention to the food pyramid when I was a kid?" But I'm not gonna remember all that off the top of my head right now. That's a long time ago. So, but like, it's the same idea, right? You can't just consume the same thing over and over and over again and hope like everything's just gonna work out, right? You have to round yourself out with a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And I think it's the same with informational consumption. Is
Undoubtedly.
that
I think so. You mentioned something that does make it tricky, which is there is this more, I think this idea, this belief that we should be an informed public, and I agree with it completely. But it can become a slippery slope these days because this is not back in the day where there was the 6:30 news. We have news
right?
available all the time, and then those news services are gonna be competing, and so they're competing for clicks and views and all these things, so they're gonna try to hook on things that, again, rile us up in some form or fashion, and so that's what they're going for. Our news services, many of them are really biased, and they get us mad at each other. We lose what is the main thing? It's people. So, but we
Right.
get so focused on these tribal type of things, honestly, that people we care about, we get upset with. But to give an example, getting away from the political, but to give an example of what I'm referring to and how it distorts us. If you think about the last time you scrolled news or did something like that, did you read about, or I mean, did you watch something that was talking about some crime that occurred? Yes, right? How
Yep.
many news stories were they on out there on that person who drove home after work that day, had dinner, sat down with family, watched some good TV, and went to bed? Well, that's not newsworthy. But for
Right.
our brain, what happens is what the input is it affects our perception. I had a client one time that was terribly fearful of someone breaking in their house and doing them harm. And at one point I asked them, "How likely do you think this is?" I said 50-50. So that is truly terrifying. If I thought every time I put my head to the pillow, something bad could happen like that, that'd be terrifying. But what happened is this person was watching the news, the local, news for the city, Memphis, that's near us. And so they were inundated with this information. Well, that affects our brains. We all of a sudden think that's more likely. And so it's just the human, we're not made for that kind of thing. So just being careful about the source of news. My recommendation is 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes in the early afternoon, and then cut it off. We're informed, but we're not overwhelmed.
Love that. It's it's such a practical. It's almost like exercise, right? You said or movement, 30 minutes,
Sure.
and here it is again, like news or informational consumption, 30 minutes, but do it. You could even break it up into smaller chunks to fit it
Yes, absolutely.
within your schedule. So before we get to the speed round, I want to ask you one more question, just because we've gone now through the entire Primal Five, and it's like to me, it's now become obvious. Like, oh yeah, these are the things that bring me energy or deplete my energy if I don't do them, sort of thing. And so it's like I think it's really interesting, exciting now that I'm starting to understand this. But how do you stay consistent with these habits when life inevitably gets chaotic?
There are a few things that I think are really important for that. The first is scheduling or routine, I guess is a better term, better word for what I'm looking
Sure.
for. Routine helps tremendously. What routine does, when we can establish a routine, it takes thinking out of it. And that helps
Yep.
us when we're thinking about choices. I mentioned earlier that I walk my dogs every morning, and I promise you this, if every time that alarm went off, if every time when my feet hit the ground, I gave myself the choice, do I want to do this? I'm not going to be walking very often, right? Because it's just, again, asking ourselves that every time, whatever feeling I'm having at that time is usually going to direct what I decide to do. So routine really helps us to just go ahead and, the old Nike, or quote is just do it, is we just get
Right.
moving. That's one thing that's really important. I think another thing that's related to that that's really important is we don't always have to feel like we want to. If we're relying on being motivated all the time, we're not going to make many changes because just the reality is we're not going to feel like it. And
Right.
so moving forward doesn't mean we need to be gung ho and such. And it's not easy. I mean, we want to do what we feel like. Allowing ourselves to slip, and this is such a big one, is allowing ourselves to slip. Like you said, days get busy, things like that. Okay, well, if I slipped, use it as an information piece. Okay, well, I slipped. This was going on. What might be good in the future? Because real change involves plateaus and dips. And then I keep working at it. And now I have something because I've learned where the places I can slip are. I'm more prepared. And so I can keep it up. But we're not going to be perfect. Just that's the essential. And we're going to slip. And as long as we're continuing to move forward with it, that's success.
Love that. So practical, right? Of just like allow yourself some grace, be consistent, like these, and you can really start to replenish yourself. I think in a more healthy way than I think a lot of us, myself at least, have been doing in recent times. All right, so I want to go from the serious to the not so
All
serious.
right,
Let's
let's
jump
go.
into the speed round. 5 quick questions,
Nice,
nothing to do
nice.
with anything. What's the first kid show theme song that comes to mind?
Scooby Doo.
Scooby Doo. Nice.
Absolutely.
What was your very first job?
That was the only job I ever got fired from, which was landscaping. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Would you rather spend 24 hours with a toddler-sized T-Rex or a T-Rex-sized toddler?
Definitely a toddler-sized T-Rex. Unquestionably. I mean, those diapers would be unbearable.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
See, that's a practical answer,
There you
right?
go.
Yeah. What's your go-to karaoke song or the one you would sing if you had to?
Well, I mean, if I had the chops, it would be Thunder Road, but since I don't,
Okay.
I think it would be You Never Even Called Me by My Name. It's an old David Allen Coe song. It's a good sing-along.
Got it. Excellent. Finally, what's the weirdest thing you've ever carried around in your bag, briefcase, or pockets?
Weird is I don't know. I think that the most inconvenient is when I would have like a chocolate, you know, something in my pocket and then would find out I had it when it got out of the dryer. But I think to me, one of the things that I just think is silly because of the superstition is whenever my kids would play a sport, and I'd have a ticket from it, if they had a good game, that thing was staying forever. Like I have so many old baseball, tickets from some, little tournament they played in. I just couldn't get rid of them. So I'd keep them in my bag or keep them in my pocket, in my
Love that.
wallet.
A
Mhm.
great answer. So cool. Matt, before we wrap up, I want to make sure people know where they can learn more about your work. If someone wants to learn more about you and Primal Five, where should they go?
Well, just visit the website. It's our Primal Five, the number 5.com. And it has a newsletter there that you can subscribe to. It has a link to the workbook on Amazon and some just general information about it. So that'd be great. I'd love it if people gave it a look. And the hope with this has my hope with it, I just thought to myself, if I wrote one thing, what could be the most impactful? Like if there was one shot and one thing that I think in all my time of being a psychologist, what would be most helpful? And this is where I landed. And I really just it's a passion. I think that for dads, I think that it's something that can allow you to be the best that you can be at these things that you care about and value so much. Cause that's really at the end of the day, that's what we want, is to be as invested and engaged with what we value the most. And I think for a lot of us dads, that's exactly what it is.
Love that. Well, Matt, I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you so much for being here. I think a lot of dads are going to hear themselves in what you shared today, right? Like, I think a lot of us need more sunlight. A lot of us need to, we use the excuse of we don't have time, but there are ways to fit some of these things in to allow us to replenish ourselves, get a little bit more energy back. so we can be more present, be more patient in the situation, and be there for those we care about most. And I appreciate you kind of walking us through the Primal Five. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today. Finally, before you go, if you're a dad listening to this and you find yourself in between navigating a season that feels different, head to gaptogig.com and subscribe to the Gap to Gig newsletter. It comes out every Friday, and it's a quieter space to reflect on work, life, and what really matters right now. And if this conversation resonated, consider sending it to another dad who might need to hear it. Until next time, I'm Michael Jacobs. Thanks for showing up and listening to Gap to Gig.